So that we have it. So, friends, this is Dr. Barry Jones. I'm wearing my A.E. Sloan shirt because a client and a collaborator and friend for some years now. And I asked him if he would tell his story about his own leadership and his leadership at Irving Bible Church. I have to just tell you up front that I probably brag about Barry's church more than any other work with. Because Barry has done a remarkable job, and Irving Bible Church is a remarkable place. It's
Mm.
literally gone through some deep
So
trends.
kind of you.
So, so Barry, just would you start? You're going to be talking to a bunch of our doctoral students, all of them leading in different contexts. Tell them your story and the story of Irving Bible Church.
Yeah, so it's crazy. I discovered Irving Bible Church. We're in Irving, Texas, just outside of Dallas. I discovered this church in 1994, almost 30 or a little over 30 years ago now. And I was a college student at the time and just really felt like, wow, this is the kind of church that I would love to be a part of one day. And so the idea that 30 years later I get to do this just it completely blows my mind. And yet I can see it as this is the story that God has been writing for a long time. Um, IBC became our church home, my wife and I, in 2000. And then from 2003 to 2006, I was at Wheaton College. So we were living in the suburbs of Chicago. Came back and I joined the faculty at Dallas Seminary in 2006 and then started preaching as a member of the preaching team here at IBC in 2007. So I've been around the church for a long time, but it was actually 2019 that I became the senior pastor. So after years of being full-time professor, part-time pastor, I shifted and became a full-time senior pastor at Irving Bible Church. My predecessor had been here 32 years in the role, but we had been a church in decline for a number of years. And so that change in a lot of ways, even some of the conversation that Todd and I have had, was a recognition a little bit of the elders kind of saying, take us back to our glory days, right? That we were a large suburban church and been in decline. And so get us back there. And I introduced some change early on that wasn't about getting us back to the glory days of the past, but was actually the sense of what I felt like the church needed to be for the community that we were in. And so in 2020, we launched a new vision for the church and said that God is calling us, the people of Irving Bible Church, to become a multi-ethnic movement of missionary disciples formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world. So we put that commitment to becoming a more fully multi-ethnic church right at the heart of our vision. And I had no idea at the time all that that would entail, all that that would involve, all of the resistance and sabotage that would be generated by that. I didn't have the framework of adaptive leadership, adaptive challenge at the time, and yet that's what we introduced to our congregation through this vision. And of course, that was the beginning of 2020. We laid out that vision in January and February. I went on a trip internationally and got back to town on the 12th of March, 2020, just as we went everything into shutdown mode. And so, yeah, introduced this vision of becoming a more fully multi-ethnic church. And then all that 2020 entailed with regard to racial injustice, with regard to global pandemic, with regard to the political tensions. And it was a really incredibly disruptive year. It was true for everybody leading churches through that time, and yet uniquely true for us, I think, given this vision that we'd introduced right at the beginning of that year. And I found myself at the end of 2020 just um, having kind of been pummeled by many of these people that I'm actually trying to lead and love. And it was really at the end of 2020 that my board said, "Hey, we would love to get you connected to a leadership coach, and just provide somebody that can be that sounding board for you as you're leading through all that comes with kind of this vision that we're pursuing." And I thought that sounds great, but where do I find such a person? And it was the week after that conversation with my elder board that I heard Todd on Steve Cuss's podcast and talking about what was happening with the Leadership Center at Fuller and coaching. And I just reached out, didn't actually imagine, Todd, that you and I would connect personally. But as you recall, we had our first phone call on January 6th, 2021. I was sitting in the parking lot as everything was happening in the Capitol. You and I were getting to know each other. And you graciously said at the end of that call that this was the kind of thing that you'd love to work on with me, and so we've been doing that ever since.
I want to say something here that I think is really significant. What's powerful about this is we often talk about how you need technical competence and relational congruence to build the trust for adaptive
Mm,
change. In one sense, nobody was more trusted than you. You've
mm,
been there a
mm,
long time.
mm.
It's a Bible church. You're a Bible
Yeah,
professor. You're a gifted preacher. You knew these people. You have deep relationships. Your
yeah.
mother's in the church, right?
Right.
You had
Yeah,
you had everything going for you. And when you started introducing adaptive change, you did so the way most of us were trained, which is
yeah,
you cast a vision, call people to it, they'll be inspired, and of course they'll do it. And what happened is you actually got the resistance
mm,
at that moment.
yeah,
And why I love to use you as an example is there was probably nobody more prepared for the old
mm,
style of
yeah,
leadership than you were.
yeah,
And you recognized at this moment that the kind of deep transformation Irving Bible Church needed to literally reach its neighbors was going to require a different kind of leadership. And that's where we
yeah.
stepped in together.
Yeah, and I had this realization early on in one of our conversations where I think I said to you something to the effect of like, I never would have said this out loud. I didn't consciously think this, but I think intuitively what I thought is introducing this vision of and putting multi-ethnic, that commitment to reflecting the incredible diversity of our community. And I didn't mention this before, but Irving, Texas is one of the most diverse cities in the country. There was an article that came out a few years back that indicated that one of our zip codes was the most ethnically diverse zip code in the nation, with second place being in Queens, New York, and third place being out in the Bay Area in California. And so we are this incredibly diverse community, and that diversity is only increasing. And yet, historically, we've been a predominantly, um, almost exclusively white congregation that grew really large. In a lot of ways, following some of that old way of thinking about the homogenous unit principle in the 90s. Um, and so I recognize that it's kind of a missional imperative for us to reflect the diversity of the community around us. But I really thought naively, this is what I said to you. I, I think that I thought that I could Dr. Jones my way through this, right? Meaning, I teach the Bible. It's what I do. Um, and so that I could open up the scriptures and I could show how this multi-ethnic vision of God is on display from Genesis to Revelation. It's the very heart of the story that the great commission of Jesus is go into all the world, make disciples, panta ta ethne, of all ethnicities, right? The word is right there in the Great Commission. I felt like our mission statement was a sort of re-articulation, a paraphrase of the Great Commission for our community. And so I'll just open up the Bible. I'll Dr. Jones my way through this. And people will hear this is near and dear to the heart of God from Genesis to Revelation. Everybody will fall enthusiastically in line. Of course, that's not what happened. I got angry emails and difficult phone calls and coffee appointments. I at one point was accused of shaming the entire white race in one sermon, which seemed like quite an accomplishment if I could pull that off in one sermon. But I mean, it was trying to speak with conviction, with courage, with pastoral care and sensitivity to the people of color, particularly African American people in our congregation, in the midst of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, all that happened in 2020, and just the level of I was unprepared for the level of resistance and sabotage that we would experience. Um, and so a lot of that work early on that Todd, you and I did together was really about me developing that resilience, doing that deep soul work that I needed to do. I spent 15 years teaching spiritual formation and graduate level courses, but there was spiritual formation that I desperately needed that I didn't even know that I needed until I found myself in the midst of that place of just being bombarded with criticism. I think back to the sort of old version of me 10 years ago. If you'd said, fill in the blank, I would do anything to avoid blank. For me, that my personality would probably be disappointing people. And yet now it's kind of part of my job description, right? I've heard the line from you over and over again. Um, Leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. And as I mentioned, we've sometimes shortened that in our context to say leadership is disappointing people, right? It's just just the reality of it. And sometimes we like to shorten it even further and just say leadership is disappointing, right? It's this stuff is hard. Um, but and so I had to learn how to be okay when people weren't okay with me. And if we were really going to lead this deep work of change, that actually had to begin with, we could talk all day about transformational leadership, and it sounds great. It sounds glorious. Who wouldn't want to be a part of transformational leadership? And yet the reality that transformation has to start with me, and both personally and congregationally, transformation, like real deep lasting change, is often a lot slower and a lot more painful than any of us um, would prefer. And yet
Yeah.
that's the reality of real and deep and lasting change. And a lot of that had to start with me early on. So a lot of that work was about my own resilience in the early part of this process.
One of the things that I think you did so remarkably is took that responsibility on and you began to do that work. But you also recognized very quickly that you needed a team. Like you started,
Yeah.
the amount of work you've done in your staff and your
Yeah.
executive team, and even the amount of disappointed work, like getting people on that who expected that things were going to move much quicker, like
Yeah.
that you could just
Yeah.
announce it and make stuff happen.
Yep.
Talk about the process. Go from you to your team and
Yeah.
leadership, and then we'll talk about the work we're doing now with your
Yeah.
congregation.
Yeah. So one of the things we recognized early on as things were beginning to kind of really churn, we're, coming off of the global pandemic. Um, there's a strong sentiment we would hear, particularly from white people in our congregation. This is too much, too fast. While at the same time, oftentimes the sentiment, both within our staff and congregation among people of color, is like, this is too little, too slow. And we're trying to navigate that tension constantly. And so one of the things we recognized we needed to do with our team was just, in adaptive leadership, we talk about that idea of a holding environment. So pulling together our pastoral staff, we shifted our rhythm to a weekly time together, and really about developing the trust on that team so that this team could help lead that transformation. It's not something that I could do on my own. This had to become not just Barry's vision, not just the elders' vision, but something that we shared, they shared along with me. And so part of doing that for us, we actually engaged in the process of personal storytelling with our pastors. So each week we would go through and somebody would tell, we use that drawing on Eugene Peterson's observation about the language of blessed, broken, given that you find in the Eucharist and you find in many of the feeding accounts, the meal accounts in the Gospels. And Peterson says this is the pattern of the gospel. It's the pattern of the spiritual life, to be blessed, broken, and given. And so we shared stories with one another about God's blessing in our lives, about brokenness in our lives, about the way in which God has used us in the lives of other people and given this. And that process of trust building was an essential part then of engaging that team in this work, even when it was really hard, that we were in it together, we trusted each other. And so I repeated in 2021, especially, but have continued to ever since then, repeated over and over again the language from Canoeing the Mountains: start with conviction, stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. And so this conviction, God is calling us to become a multi-ethnic movement of missionary disciples. Like, that had to be not only my conviction that I was going to hold on to no matter what, but the pastoral staff and the elders. And thankfully, the elders were in it with me. We lost a lot of people through this. We lost a lot of people that had deep pockets through this. And there's never been a looking back and going, oh, maybe we messed up. Maybe we, right. It's been this deep conviction that God is calling us to this, even when it's costly. Start with conviction, stay calm, which is easier said than done, but that work of differentiation for me, and then leading the team to understand more deeply the idea of differentiation. Start with conviction, stay calm, stay connected. And so that was that, we're going to really work on building trust to lead through this together, and then stay the course. We're going to keep going no matter what. And we're now at a place where on the front end, it was costly, and we lost people and we lost dollars, and yet we are now seeing the fruit of that labor, both in terms of the metrics turning in the right direction. We're seeing new people come into the life of our church, but more importantly for us, we're seeing the vision realized. We're seeing the beautiful diversity that's there within our congregation. We're now in that place where those who write about multi-ethnic churches talk about 80-20. If 80% of your congregation, no more than 8% of your congregation is one particular racial or ethnic group, then you be considered. And I always felt like 80-20, that seems like a really low bar. And yet, um, the last numbers I remember off the top of my head were like only 13% of churches actually reflect even that 80-20 difference. We're right now at that kind of 60-40 difference in terms of seeing 40% of the congregation that would come from racial ethnic minority backgrounds. And so we're seeing the vision realized, and we're seeing a community reach. We're beginning to see growth for the first time in, I think, 18 years.
One of the most powerful parts about this part of the story is that there's two parts. We always talk about, starting with the things you're going to preserve, the values.
Yeah.
So it's important to say again, you're a Bible church.
Yep.
So the scriptures are really important. So you always taught from the scriptures, and you
Mhm.
demonstrated that this wasn't some response to culture, or this wasn't some, trying to connect to some denominational mandate or something.
Yeah.
You're a
Yeah.
Bible church. And you always had a vision of loving your neighbor. Like, we're going to
Yeah.
be missional. It just happened that
Yeah.
there was a time when
Yeah.
your neighbors all looked like you.
Right. Yes.
And the
Yeah.
church grew in that
Yep.
homogeneous like
Yep.
time.
Yeah.
It was the conviction as the neighborhood changed,
Yeah.
biblical conviction and our missional conviction required us to change.
Yes.
And that part is so important to recognize. It
Yeah.
wasn't just you coming in with enthusiasm and saying, "This is what God gave me, I'm going to do it." It really was
Yeah.
built out of who their own DNA, even that which they.
Yeah. 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 I think I told you about feedback I heard recently. A family that had been away from our church for about 10 years. It's moved back to the area, come back to IBC. And I was so encouraged by the way that the man said it. He said, um, to a friend of mine, he said, it feels like nothing has changed and that everything has changed. Like, on the one hand, it feels like a totally different congregation because of all the diversity that's here. And it feels like the same old IBC, right? And that is that idea of healthy adaptation of core DNA, that we're going to stay true to who we are, some of these core aspects, our commitment to being a Bible church, our commitment to reaching our community, some of these things that are going to stay because it's essential to who we are. And yet, how do we actually have to change to stay true to who we are?
Yeah.
And that's the work that we've been trying to pursue.
So one of the other, this is such an important piece, because one of the other parts I want to say is when you talked about that 80-20 principle, like, so amongst experts that talk about multi-ethnic churches, they would
Yeah,
say when your church is 20% diverse, you can now consider yourself a multi-ethnic church.
yeah,
Your church is at 40%
yeah.
diverse, 60% of the dominant culture, 40% diverse. What's interesting is that almost all the sociologists say that the tipping point is around 30.
Mm,
30 is usually the crisis point. Like, that's what
yeah,
organization people say, "Oh, we actually are different." And
yeah,
you know that I came and visited your church, and I was literally in tears the whole time, because here's this church that has lived into this vision, and like, you could just see it on the faces of
mm,
people. You could see it
mm,
in the diversity of people. You showed me a video where the people serving in the church are
yeah,
people of color.
yeah,
It's not just like,
yeah,
well-intended white folks serving our neighbors. It's
yeah.
it's really, so in almost every way, you could be forgiven if you said, "We made it."
Mm,
And yet you're going a deep step deeper, because
yeah,
for this to literally be sustainable, it has to get into the bodies of all of our
yeah,
people. And
yeah.
so talk about the project we've been working on in terms of shifting the discipleship of your church to embody this vision.
Yeah. So again, a lot of our work early on, um, I introduced this adaptive challenge without realizing that's what I was doing. You jumped into it with me, and a lot of that work was around my own adaptive capacity and then preparing my team. And so that all kind of led up to then the work that we've done over the course of about the last year, um, which is to work through a strategic plan and to take our folks through a process that's very different from approaches to strategic planning that you can find elsewhere, because it's not okay. Here's the answer, right? In 2019, I went away to the cabin in Oklahoma and came back with a vision, and we didn't do it that way this time. Rather, we put together a team and began to ask some questions. And what are the core questions we need to get to? And one of the things that came up was, how do we, um, engage people in deep life-changing relationships with people who are profoundly different than they are. And so we put together that team. We began to do a series of listening sessions, focus groups, and asking people about their deepest experience of life change, of transformation, and asking people about their experience with culture and what would you want someone else to know about your cultural background. It was really interesting because some of the white people within our congregation weren't quite sure how to talk about their culture, about their ethnicity, and that was part of the learning process for them and for us as we lead them. But then one of the things that really emerged is as people began to tell their story, the walls that came down. That some of these focus groups were very kind of randomly put together, and yet you had people that were sharing really deeply and authentically, vulnerably, and connections that kind of came through that. And so we learned a lot about some of the most important aspects of life change. But one of the things we learned, not from the data, but from the experience, was the importance of personal storytelling. So I actually made that one of the pillars of the strategic plan. So from those listening exercises, we put together a strategic plan and really kind of identified the key shifts that we need to make in our congregation. Um, a shift from diversity, everyone is welcome here, to true belonging, right? It's not just everyone's welcome as long as you're comfortable with the way we do things around here, right? As long as you are comfortable assimilating to the way we do things. No, we want to move from we value diversity to a place that really we do things differently because you're here or because we want our neighbors to be here. And so to really create a place of true belonging. So from diversity to belonging, from ministry programming, we've kind of traditionally had a lot of different programs, and it's really been a sort of smorgasbord of options that people could choose from, to discipleship, making sure that all of our programming is aligned to guide people towards a deeper transformation into Christ likeness. And then the third shift for us is from mobilizing resources to mobilizing people. That we have been a church that has a great reputation in our community. When there's a crisis, we show up and we, send money, we help address needs, we send the kids to school with backpacks full, or we, provide meals for families at Thanksgiving. And so we do a lot of things both globally and locally that involve mobilizing resources. But we don't want to just be a missional church that is missional in the sense of sending money, or people that feel like, I love being a part of a church that does this, so I'll write a check to help meet people's needs. But we want to be a church that shows up and mobilizes people. And we've done that, but we can do it better. We can make that more a core part of who we are, how we operate. And so those became kind of then for us these pillars around um, creating diverse spiritual community, around deep discipleship experiences, around formative Sunday gatherings, and then around mobilizing missional community service. And then those are the kind of four pillars of the strategic plan. So then we have members of our team that are overseeing each one of those pillars and those initiatives. And we're running experiments right now that we're in the process of just the whole idea. What I keep saying to that team is we're going to try some things and we're going to see what we learn. We're going to try some things, we're going to see what we learn. And we're going to learn our way into a new reality. When it comes to curating formative Sunday gatherings, the worship pastor doesn't have to be the one with all the answers about what does multi-ethnic worship look like, or what does hospitality to a diverse community look like. Rather, we enlist people from the congregation in the process and try some things, do some experiments, and then see what we learn. And so rather than Crystal, our worship pastor, being the expert, her job is to lead the learning into continuing to grow. What does it look like to engage in formative Sunday gatherings? And that's,
So
again, just one of those pillars.
yeah, so let me mention two things there that just as a way of like my stepping back and observing, working with you. One of the things we often talk about is when you're doing prototyping, when you're doing experimenting, believe that what you're going to discover is more
Yeah.
important than what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You don't know it, but
Yep.
so you guys had the perfect example of this. You guys use storytelling because you'd
Yeah.
use storytelling, right? Like this
Yeah.
is the way
Yeah.
we feel like we connect to each other. You use storytelling, and storytelling was a way we are going to get out the data. We're going to
Yeah.
get to how do people experience being in our church, and especially the way they are, do they belong or not? That's so that
Yeah.
it was a really good tool. What we discovered was the act of storytelling
Yes.
actually was a really important process, like a really
Yeah.
important exercise, practice.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
now storytelling, and particularly storytelling of your diversity and your background and how you
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
the world and your own faith formation is now going to be central to the work you
Yeah.
guys do in your small groups, right?
Yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah.
Yeah.
That pillar of creating diverse spiritual community. Um, that one of those then initiatives with that is storytelling as a core practice, and part of that is because it emerged not from the data but from the process. We're like, that's it. Like that's gold. That's what we're after, and we want to create opportunities for what happened in those spaces to happen throughout our congregation. That really does allow people to fully be themselves within the life of this church. Belonging, it was interesting because that word belonging was the word that did emerge from the data, right? That was when people were talking about their experiences of transformation, their own experiences of life change. So often they talked about it occurred in this context of just a deep sense of belonging. And so the importance of actually recognizing um, that as the environment for this kind of deep transformation to take place, yeah, became a huge thing for us.
One of the things that we're working on even right at the moment, you mentioned about Crystal. You've got an extraordinary worship leader who does an
Mhm.
amazing job, and I've been
Yeah,
in your worship, and literally uses different languages, and not the kind of like, oh, let's include a language because we should. It's like these are
yeah,
the languages of our people sitting here.
yeah, yeah,
And what she has said is she began to realize that if hospitality began when the call to worship began,
yeah,
there was all this other piece
yeah,
that people didn't experience. So she literally said, I think my responsibility as the worship leader, who is kind of the host of this gathering, needs to figure out how that starts in the parking
yeah,
lot.
right,
So
yeah,
she's taking responsibility. So the worship director is taking
yeah,
responsibility for experimenting around hospitality on Sunday
yeah,
morning. Like
yeah, yeah,
that's a major shift, right?
yeah,
In terms of
yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We just had a gathering the other night with that team that's working on that project, and really fun to kind of process through, okay, what can we do to begin to try to help make some of these connections take place, not just, we do the kind of typical turn to your neighbor and greet one another kind of moment within our worship gathering, but how do we help those kinds of connections begin to take place before, and then how do we keep it going after? And so an experiment that we're going to try that's going to involve just a question or a couple of questions that we will have in that, that'll be part of the worship gathering, but it'll be on the screens in the pre-roll, and then we'll talk about it in the worship gathering, and then we'll encourage people to have that same conversation around that question in the town square. And then that team is going to be engaging with people to figure out, okay, what did we learn from this experiment that we're going to try over a series of weeks? Because it's all about how do we create that, different cultures have profoundly different ways of experiencing and expressing hospitality. And so, for us, it's not just that we have, one majority culture and then one minority culture. It's that we have a wide variety of different cultures represented within the life of our body. And so, what does hospitality look like in a multicultural kind of context?
Yeah. So Barry, I want to just pull this to a close by just having you reflect on. So this process started out of something God was doing in your heart in
Mm.
2019 with a church that you have loved, that you had been part of and loved for
Yeah,
almost 20 years before.
yeah,
Um, and yet now here we are 6 years later, and you're
yeah,
beginning to see these transformations begin to happen. I think
yeah,
we talk about deep adaptive change. It takes a while.
yeah.
So speak to the people who are going to listen to this. They're all leaders in contexts. What are some things that you just want to highlight for them or have them kind of take away from here?
Yeah, that's really great. So again, I would just say part of it is recognizing that to lead people through real deep lasting change, you have to be prepared to engage yourself personally in that real deep lasting change. There's just some soul work that's absolutely essential to bear the weight of all this in a way that is healthy and sustainable. And so be prepared to do your own work around differentiation. A second thing would just be how important it is that you're not bearing that weight alone, that you're engaging in strengthening the bonds of people that you are leading or that are leading with you through that work of real and deep and lasting change. And then I think just be prepared for the fact that real and deep and lasting change is often, if not always, slower than we'd like it to be and more painful than we'd like it to be. And yet, the good news is when you endure the slow, sometimes painful work, you can truly experience real and deep and lasting change.
Awesome. Thank you, Barry. That's
Yeah,
awesome. Really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Really glad to be part.